They fought like enemies. They spoke like rivals. They carried each other's names like scars, etched deep by years of pain, pride, and unforgettable nights under blinding lights. For the world, they were legends. For each other, they were something far more complicated. And after nearly 40 years of silence, Muhammad Ali finally stood face to face with the one man who defined his greatest battles. Joe Frazier. This wasn't a press conference. There were no cameras flashing in their faces. No roaring crowd. No gloves, no bell, no referee waiting to step in. What happened next didn't take place in a ring. It happened in a quiet space where time had slowed, where words carried more weight than punches ever did. For decades, their names had been spoken together like a warning. Ali and Frazier, fire and steel, speed and pressure, poetry and brutality. They had given the world some of the most violent, heroic, and unforgettable moments in boxing history. They had taken years from each other's lives, and they had walked away carrying wounds no belt could ever heal. But when the cheering stopped, when the lights faded, something remained unfinished. Because rivalries don't always end when the fights do. Sometimes they live on in silence, in resentment, in things that were said but never taken back, in respect that was felt but never spoken. Now, decades later, the noise was gone. Ali was no longer the fast-talking hurricane the world remembered. Time and illness had slowed him. His body carried the cost of greatness. Frazier, too, stood older now, proud-guarded, still carrying the weight of a rivalry that history never fully let him escape. Two men, 2 lifetimes of conflict, one final moment. No audience demanded anything from them. No title was on the line. Only the question that had waited 40 years to be answered. What happens when 2 warriors who defined each other finally meet? Not as fighters, but as men. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments in sports don't happen under the lights. They happen when the fight is finally over. Have you ever had unfinished history with someone you could never forget? Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier didn't just fight for championships. They fought for something far heavier. They fought for pride, for identity, for the right to define themselves in an era where boxing meant more than sport. It meant survival, voice, and legacy. Their rivalry wasn't built overnight. It was forged in pressure, politics, and personal belief. Ali was the outspoken revolutionary, fast with his fists, faster with his words. He challenged authority, mocked opponents, and turned boxing into theater. Frazier was the relentless grinder, quiet, proud, unforgiving. He fought without flash, without mercy, and without ever backing down. When they met, it wasn't just 2 heavyweights colliding. It was 2 worldviews. 3 brutal wars followed. The fight of the century, where Frazier handed Ali his first professional loss and proved he would not be overshadowed. Super Fight 2, less celebrated, but no less punishing. And then Thrilla in Manila, a fight so violent, so exhausting, so close to death, that both men would later say it nearly ended their lives. They pushed each other beyond pain, beyond strategy, beyond what the human body should endure. Ali once said it was the closest thing to dying he ever experienced. Frazier fought nearly blind in one eye, refusing to quit until his corner stopped the fight for him. Those nights took years from both men. But the real damage wasn't only physical, it was emotional. Ali's words, sharp, cruel, and relentless, cut deeper than any left hook. He mocked Frazier publicly, belittled him, turned the rivalry into something personal that followed Joe everywhere he went. Crowds laughed. Media repeated it, history amplified it, and Frazier never forgot. For him the fights ended, but the humiliation didn't. When the gloves were finally hung up, there was no handshake of closure, no shared respect in public, no peace. They went their separate ways, carrying the same memories, but very different pain. Ali was celebrated as the greatest. Frazier felt erased, reduced to a supporting character in someone else's legend. Years turned into decades. Silence hardened into resentment, and the rivalry froze in time. Because some battles don't end when the bell rings. They end only when the words finally stop hurting. And for Ali and Frazier, that moment took nearly 40 years to arrive. Time did what boxing never could. It slowed everything. Muhammad Ali, once the fastest mouth and fastest hands the sport had ever known, began to move differently. His voice, once sharp and playful, softened into something fragile. His steps became careful, measured. Parkinson's disease took what even the ring had failed to claim. Not his spirit, but his speed. Not his legacy, but his body. The man who once danced around giants now needed help standing still, and the world watched in silence. Ali became a symbol of courage, of resilience, of greatness enduring pain. He was honored everywhere he went, applauded, protected. Meanwhile, Joe Frazier aged away from the spotlight. Still proud, still stubborn, still carrying wounds no doctor could treat. Frazier had given Ali his hardest fights, his first loss, his most terrifying night in Manila. Yet history rarely paused to remember that. Where Ali was celebrated, Frazier felt minimized, reduced to the rival, the obstacle, the footnote. And that hurt more than any punch. Because Joe Frazier never saw himself as second to anyone. He had earned his place with blood, grit, and refusal to quit. But decades passed, and the story didn't change. Ali's name grew larger, Frazier's faded. There were no phone calls between them, no quiet conversations, no chance to clear the air, just distance. And silence has a way of hardening things. What once might have been resolved with a few honest words slowly turned into something heavier, resentment mixed with regret. Not just about what was said, but about what was never taken back. As the years went on, both men were forced to sit with their memories. Ali, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him, had time to reflect on the cost of his words, on the line between promotion and cruelty, on how far a rivalry had gone. Frazier, watching the world praise the man who once mocked him, carried the weight quietly. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't seek reconciliation. But the pain stayed. Because some rivalries don't fade with age, they linger. Until one quiet moment, no cameras announced it, no crowd demanded it, when fate placed them in the same space again. Two men shaped by the same wars, two lives permanently altered by the same nights. Not champions anymore, not enemies, just time-worn warriors standing at the edge of memory. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, there was nothing left to fight over. Only the past, and the question of whether it was finally time to let it go. There was no announcement, no reporters crowding the doorway, no cameras rushing in to capture history. This wasn't a moment built for headlines. It was quiet. Muhammad Ali was helped into the room slowly. His body no longer moved the way the world remembered. His hands trembled. His posture leaned forward, fragile, but his eyes were still sharp, still present. Across the room stood Joe Frazier, older now, heavier in the shoulders. His stance was familiar, grounded, stubborn, unyielding. The same man who once walked through hell without backing down. For a long second, neither man spoke, no insults, no jokes, no bravado, just silence. And that silence carried 40 years of history, 40 years of punches absorbed and delivered, of pride defended at all costs, of words spoken too loudly and remembered too long. The air felt heavy like the moment before a bell that never rang. Ali looked at Joe, not as an opponent, not as a villain, not as the man he once mocked for the world to hear, but as the one person who had truly tested him. The man who took him to places no one else ever could, the rival who forced greatness out of him through pain. For the first time, there was no performance left to give, no audience to entertain. Ali took a breath. It wasn't easy. Every movement required effort now. Every second demanded patience. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand toward Joe. It shook, not from fear but from time. Frazier watched it happen. He didn't step forward, didn't step back. He simply waited. That trembling hand carried more meaning than any punch Ali had ever thrown. It carried regret, recognition, a lifetime of unfinished business. Ali's eyes never left Joe's face. And then, softly, almost carefully, he spoke. Not with poetry, not with jokes, not with the sharp tongue that once dominated the world. Just truth. The words came out slower than they once would have, but they landed heavier. In that moment, Ali wasn't the greatest. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a legend. He was just a man finally acknowledging another. The room stayed still. Frazier didn't interrupt, didn't look away. For decades, he had carried the weight of being disrespected, diminished, and overshadowed. He had waited, consciously or not, for something that never came. Until now. Ali's voice was quiet, but it held everything he hadn't said before. Everything he couldn't say when pride still mattered more than peace. The rivalry that once demanded violence now demanded honesty. No gloves, no referee. No bell to save either man from the moment. Just two fighters standing face to face, not deciding who was stronger, but whether the fight was finally over. And in that fragile pause, with history pressing in from every direction, the words Ali spoke next would change how the world remembered them both. Joe, you were the greatest rival I ever had. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed softly, but carried the weight of 40 years. Muhammad Ali didn't smile when he said it. There was no grin, no rhythm, no playful edge. None of the bravado that once defined him. Just truth. The kind that comes late in life, when there's nothing left to prove and nowhere left to hide. Joe Frazier didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, the way it always had before a fight. His eyes dropped, not in weakness, but in restraint. Because for years, decades, really, he had waited for those words. Not publicly, not loudly, but quietly, privately. He had carried the feeling that no matter what he did in the ring, it would never be enough to earn that acknowledgement. That history had already decided his role. And suddenly, there it was. No cameras, No crowd, no reason to say it, except honesty. Ali stood there, breathing slowly, as if every word cost him something now. Then he continued. I couldn't have been Ali without you. No pause for effect, no dramatic delivery. Just a sentence spoken plainly and meant completely. In that moment, the rivalry finally shifted. Because that wasn't praise, it was admission. Ali wasn't talking about belts, or fame, or headlines. He was talking about meaning. About the truth every great fighter knows but rarely says out loud, that greatness is never built alone. Joe Frazier wasn't just an opponent, he was the mirror, the test, the standard. Without Joe's pressure, Ali's speed meant nothing. Without Joe's refusal to quit, Ali never would have reached the edge of himself. Without Joe, there was no Manila, no survival, no legend sharpened by suffering. Frazier swallowed hard. His hands stayed at his sides. His posture stayed firm. But something shifted behind his eyes. Because recognition, real recognition, doesn't need applause. It needs sincerity. For years, Frazier had been painted as the villain, the obstacle, the man standing in the way of someone else's greatness. And now, at the end of it all, that story finally changed. Not rewritten by history, but corrected by the one person whose words mattered most. Ali didn't apologize outright. He didn't revisit old insults or explain himself. He didn't need to. This wasn't about erasing the past. It was about honoring it. Two men who built their lives on toughness understood something few others could. That respect, spoken too late, still matters. That acknowledgement doesn't weaken you. It completes you. The room remained silent, not awkwardly, but reverently, as if the past itself was listening. No belts hung between them. No trophies mattered anymore. Just two fighters standing at the end of their journey, one finally saying what should have been said long ago, and the other finally hearing it. For men who had spent their lives proving strength with fists, this moment, quiet, restrained, and deeply human, was the hardest victory either of them would ever earn. Joe Frazier nodded slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He didn't reach for drama. That wasn't his way. But something unmistakable happened in that quiet movement of his head. The weight he had carried for decades, the anger, the resentment, the feeling of being diminished by history, lifted just enough for him to breathe again. Not gone, not erased, but finally acknowledged. For a man like Frazier, that mattered more than applause. They stood there together. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, two aging warriors whose bodies bore the cost of everything they had given the sport. No belts between them. No cameras demanding a pose. No crowd waiting for a winner. Just respect, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken twice. For years, the world had framed their relationship as hatred, as bitterness frozen in time, as a rivalry that never healed. But what unfolded in that room wasn't reconciliation in the way people expect. There was no embrace, no tearful apology, no dramatic moment built for headlines. It was something quieter and far rarer. Understanding. Ali didn't need forgiveness. Frazier didn't need revenge. What they needed was truth, and they finally had it. When word of the meeting began to spread, it didn't move like a rumor. It moved like a realization. Fighters talked about it in gyms. Trainers mentioned it between rounds. Old champions shook their heads in silence. Because everyone in boxing understood what that moment meant. They knew how pride works. How hard it is to let go of resentment, especially when it feels justified. They knew how rare it is for a champion to admit that someone else helped make them great. This wasn't about rewriting history. It was about completing it. Fans who had grown up watching Ali and Frazier fight didn't react with excitement. They reacted with emotion. Some felt relief. Some felt sadness. Some felt something they couldn't quite name. Because for the first time, the rivalry wasn't defined by violence. It was defined by peace. Not the loud kind. Not the celebratory kind. The earned kind. The kind that only comes after everything else has been stripped away: youth, speed, fame, ego, leaving only what was real. Two men who once tried to break each other, now standing in the same space without anger. That image did something to people. It reminded them that even the fiercest rivalries don't have to end in bitterness. That strength isn't only proven in combat, and that sometimes, the bravest thing a fighter can do, is lay the fight down. The boxing world didn't weep because it saw weakness. It wept because it saw humanity. Because it saw two men who had given everything, finally give each other something too. Closure, not perfect, not complete, but enough. And in a sport built on pain, that quiet moment of peace felt louder than any knockout ever had. Muhammad Ali passed away years later. The world mourned loudly. Tributes poured in from every corner: fighters, presidents, artists, children who had never seen him box but knew what he stood for. They spoke of courage, of conviction, of a man who changed sports, culture, and history. Ali was remembered as the greatest. Not long after Joe Frazier followed, his passing was quieter, more restrained. but no less heavy. Those who truly knew boxing paused, because they understood something the headlines often missed. You cannot tell Ali's story without Frazier, and you cannot understand Frazier without Ali. That final meeting, quiet, undocumented, almost invisible to the public, changed how many people looked back on their rivalry, not because it erased the pain, not because it rewrote what was said or done, but because it reframed the ending. For decades, their story had been frozen in conflict. Two men locked forever in opposition, one celebrated, one misunderstood. But in that last chapter, the narrative softened. They were no longer just rivals. They were two men who pushed each other beyond human limits, physically, emotionally, spiritually. They gave each other their hardest nights. They took pieces of each other no one else could, and in doing so, they forged greatness neither could have reached alone. That's the part history often forgets. Greatness doesn't grow in isolation. It grows in resistance, in opposition, in the presence of someone who refuses to let you be anything less than your best. Ali needed Frazier's pressure. Frazier needed Ali's brilliance. And in the end, both needed acknowledgement. That final moment wasn't about forgiveness in the traditional sense. It wasn't about apology or redemption arcs. It was about recognition. About finally saying, you mattered. What we shared mattered. What we endured mattered. And sometimes that's enough. The fight didn't end with a knockout. It didn't end with a raised hand. It ended with understanding. Two warriors who had spent their lives proving strength through fists, finally proving it through humility. Because real strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need witnesses. Real strength shows up when pride steps aside, when ego loosens its grip, when someone chooses peace even though they've earned the right to hold on to anger. That's what made this moment unforgettable. Not the fame, not the history, not even the rivalry, but the courage to let it go. Greatness isn't just about how hard you fight. It's about whether you're brave enough to stop fighting when the time comes. If you believe real strength is found in forgiveness, not victory, type RESPT and tell me. Is there someone from your past you'd still want to make peace with?